السلام عليكم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Continuing with slavery and Islam, part 2. In the last session, we talked about the history of slavery around the world before and after Islam, how they captured slaves and treated them versus what Islamic fundamentals are through several verses of the Quran and authentic narrations. We talked about how Islam started closing all methods of taking slaves and Islamic ruling on captives of war. In this session, we will discuss Islam and treatment of captives, Islamic approach in systematically freeing slaves that led to eradication of this practice. We will also summarize slaves' rights and related rulings, and then the conclusion, inshallah. So if you have not listened to part 1, please do so, as it will give you the background. Now, Islam and treatment of captives. Anyone who examines the events during the World War I and World War II can clearly see how the so-called civilized people who opposed slavery treated their prisoners of war, and how many committed war crimes against the prisoners of countries they occupied, and how some prisoners ended up in death camps. And if they were lucky and did not go to the death camps, they lived in horrible conditions within these prisons, often had only one meal a day, often tortured and experimented on like animals. They were treated nothing like the old traditional slaves. Only after these camps were discovered by the Allied forces, their crimes against humanity were exposed. Millions died in the death camps and gas chambers, which included women, children, and old people. The treatment of Allied forces was not much better with their POWs, as they too killed many of their captives, raped women, and tortured many. In Siberia, many of the prisoners of war were put to work in mines and labor camps, and often worked so hard that they died out of exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. In recent years, the treatment of U.S. soldiers at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq and Guantanamo Bay were exposed, and many more that goes on even today, all from nations who claim to be civilized and condemn slavery. So basically, despite of human rights laws, today harsh punishment of prisoners of war continues by many nations around the world. It seems they have abolished just the name slavery. Now, let's see what is Islamic ruling on treatment of captives and how did early Muslims treat their combatant enemies once they were captured. Number 1, after their capture, Muslims must hold them or prevent them from escaping, but they have no right to harm the captives in any way. If it so happens that there are women and children, the children are not allowed to be separated from their parents. They have to be together. Number 2, as mentioned, Muslims had no prisons. As such, no real prisoners of war. So the captives must be either freed or ransomed, according to the verse we recited last time, فَإِمَّا مَنَّا بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فَدَاء. فَإِمَّا مَنَّا بَعْدُ وَإِمَّا فَدَاء. But if their freedom at the time is not advisable, the captives are taken to the Muslims' homes instead of prisons or labor camps. and treated as part of the family. Hence, they were fed same as the family and clothed same as the family. According to a report in Musnad of Ahmad, volume 4, Prophet ﷺ instructed, quote, your captives, your captives, your captives, feed them from that which you eat, and clothe them that which you wear yourself, unquote. Number 3, regarding their work, they should not be given hard labor tasks. According to At-Taj al-Jami' al-Usul, volume 2, the Prophet ﷺ instructed, quote, do not force your captives to work hard, and if you assign them a hard task, then help them, unquote. Number 4, according to Sahih Bukhari, volume 11, the Prophet ﷺ instructed, quote, none of you should call his captive my slave or my servant. You should call them my son or my daughter. Number 5, treat them well as you would treat, your own children. So for the captives, the noble Quran has also a message that conveys mercy and compassion, a message that renews the spirit of those who were defeated and gives them glad tidings of a new life, as it says, يا أيها أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها النبي قل لمن في أيديكم من الأسرى إن يعلم الله في قلوبكم خيرا يؤتكم خيرا مما أخذ منكم ويغفر لكم والله غفور رحيم. O Prophet, say to those who are captives in your hands, if Allah finds any good in your hearts, He will give you something better than what has been taken from you, and He will forgive you, for Allah is the forgiving, the merciful. Chapter 8, verse 70. If you just take this message of compassion against any other message of intimidation, it tells you how just and compassionate Islam is toward its enemies. Many of these captives gained their freedom in hands of Muslims and embraced Islam and served Islam. When you compare the Islamic rulings and Prophet ﷺ's treatment regarding the captives with the way others treated their captives, you will see who was truly civilized. Ironically, these instructions regarding treatment of captives were implemented at a time when not just in Arabia, but the rest of the world, captives were treated horribly and often tortured, their men often castrated or dismembered, and their women forced to prostitution, whereas Quran explicitly says, and we talked about it last time, وَلَا تُكْرِهُ فَتَيَاتِكُمْ عَلَى الْبِغَاءِ. Do not force your captive women to prostitution. Chapter 24, verse 33. And in Islam, torture of anyone, including slaves, is categorically forbidden. According to Farsnameh, Ibn Balkhi says, Second Shapur, the king of Persia, used to take Arab captives, pull both of their shoulders together, then put a hole through both of them, and insert a ring through these holes. As a result, he became known as Dhul Aktaf. Dhul Aktaf. In Al-Jami' al-Saghir fi Ahadith al-Bashir al-Nadhir, volume 1, Suyuti says, Prophet ﷺ said, quote, fear Allah regarding the captives in your hands, clothe their bodies and feed their bellies and speak to them softly, unquote. According to Sunan of Abu Dawud, volume 4, the Prophet ﷺ said, quote, anyone who slaps what his hand possesses, the slave or the servant, or beat him up, its kafara, expiation, is to set him free, unquote. Now, what was Islam's systematic approach in freeing the slaves, in liberating the slaves? Islam encouraged and aimed to free slaves in multiple ways that eventually led to abolishing this practice. Islam teaches that all men and women should be free and be able to enjoy their freedom. The only reason Muslims took captives in battles, and only in battles, was so later they could exchange them with the Muslims captured by the enemy. Otherwise, if Muslims did not take captives, they would be at a disadvantage point with the enemy, as they would have no captives to exchange with. There were also times when slaves, from the other side, escaped their masters and joined the Muslim camps, even when there were no ongoing battles. In such cases, Muslims considered these slaves free. Sahih Bukhari in Kitab al-Talaq reports from Abdullah ibn Abbas that if a slave man or woman migrated from the idolater's camp and joined the Muslim community, they would be free. And if a slave man or a woman from an idolater camp with whom Muslims had signed a peace treaty migrated and joined the Muslim community, they would not be returned to their masters, but Muslims would pay their masters and purchase their freedom. Prophet ﷺ established many ways to free the slaves from the idolaters' camps. So one can imagine his efforts to free the existing slaves in the hands of Muslims. Abu Dawud in his Sunan, volume 4, reports from Ali ibn Abi Talib that Prophet ﷺ's last words were, prayer, prayer, prayer. Fear Allah regarding that which your hands possess, meaning your slaves, unquote. Now, here we're going to mention few of the ways devised by Islam for gradual freedom of slaves. Number 1, write-in or contract ruling. According to this ruling, a slave can write a contract with his master that for an agreed sum of money or compensation paid in installments, he can gain his freedom once all is paid. In this way, the slave is allowed to work and gain wages in order to pay his master for his freedom. Muslims were encouraged to help the slaves with monetary gifts so they could reach their goal faster and gain their freedom faster. As the Quran says, وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانَكُمْ فَكَاتُبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا وَآتُوهُمْ مِنْ مَالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. And if any of your slaves ask for a deed in writing to enable them to earn their freedom for a certain sum, give them such a deed if you know any good in them. Give them something yourself out of the means which Allah has provided you. Chapter 24, verse 33. Number 2, sadaqat or charity ruling. According to this ruling, zakat can be used to free a slave. As one of pillars of worship, Muslims who qualify must give zakat, which is called also alms or poor due, which is wajib, farida. each year to a number of causes, one of which is paying zakat to free a captive, a slave. These causes or categories are highlighted in the Quran. As it says, إنما الصدقات للفقراء والمساكين والعاملين عليها والمؤلفة قلوبهم وفي الرقاب والغارمين وفي سبيل الله وابن السبيل فريضة من الله والله عليم حكيم. Alms or zakat are for the poor and the needy and those employed to administer these funds, for those whose hearts have been recently reconciled to the truth, to free the captives and those in debt, in the cause of Allah and for the wayfarer. Thus it is ordained by Allah, and Allah has full knowledge and wisdom. Chapter 9, verse 60. Therefore, in a Muslim nation, the government has the duty to collect zakat and distribute it to these categories mentioned above, one of which is freeing slaves. Of course, if they exist, which they did back then, but they don't now in Muslim countries, shouldn't be any slaves. However, they did in those days. Number 3, offsprings, Walad ruling. By this ruling, if a slave woman married to his master gives birth to a child, not only the child is free, the slave woman is free after her master passes away, according to At-Taj al-Jam' al-Usul, Volume 2. Number 4, partnership ruling, which applies when more than one person owned a slave. The ruling, according to a prophetic narration, Al-Muwatta, from Malik ibn Anas, Volume 2, says if a person owned a slave in partnership with others, once he frees the slave, meaning his own share, assuming he can afford it, he buys out the shares of others so the slave is completely free. Number 5, expiation ruling. This was among the most common method. According to this ruling, which is spelled out in the Quran, as it says, for example, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ أو تحرير الرقبة, free a slave, or free a slave. فَتَحْرِيرُ الرَّقَبَةِ مُؤْمِنَةٍ, he should set free a believing slave. 492, chapter 4, verse 92, chapter 5, verse 89, chapter 58, verse 3. Also prophetic narrations reported in books of hadith and fiqh. One or more slaves are freed for kaffara or expiation of a sin or mistake. Number 6, kinship ruling, based on prophetic narration listed in At-Taj al-Jam' al-Usul, Volume 2, and also the Sunan, Abi Dawud Sunan, Volume 2. If someone ends up owning a slave who is a member of his family with close relationship, one with whom marriage is prohibited, that slave, that relative is free. Number 7, beating and harming rule. According to this ruling, anyone who slaps his slave or beats him up, its kaffara, expiation, is to free that slave. Of course, there are other rulings listed in books of Islamic law, jurisprudence, or fiqh, which guarantee the liberation of slaves. These are rulings that necessitate or obligate the master to free his slave. However, Islam strongly encourages Muslims to free their slaves out of their own will. And Prophet ﷺ called it a great deed, an ibadah, worship, when a Muslim frees his slave or someone else's slave out of his own will. So, through their own will and through these common rulings, Muslims freed the slaves, which eventually led to complete abolishment of this practice in the whole Muslim community. Now, if we were to summarize slaves' rights and related rulings, as we discussed, there are many ways by which slaves were freed by Islam. However, before gaining their freedom, they could still gain superiority, nobility, and honor over their masters. Through what? Through Iman and Taqwa. Because in Islam, superiority belongs to the one with honor and nobility and Taqwa. According to Sahih Bukhari, Volume 2, Prophet ﷺ said, quote, "If a black slave with braided hair is put in charge of governing, you must listen to him and obey him," unquote. And as reported by Waqidi in his book Futuh al-Sham, Abu Ubaidah, the chief commander of the Syrian army, appointed a black slave man by the name of Damas as head of his army in parts of Syria, where he conquered several enemy forts, and of course Muslims embraced his leadership and obeyed his commands. Many of the Khulafa, especially from Abbasid dynasty, were sons of slave women. There were many governors among other Muslim nations who were sons of slave women. If Islam did not honor them and respect them as equal human beings and caused Muslims to respect them, would they have gotten to be in such positions? Slave men could and did lead the prayers as imams, and their testimonies in the Islamic courts were equally accepted. Also, a non-Muslim slave was never forced to convert to Islam. Another point is that it was customary that pagan Arabs used to bring women to the battlefield to cheer them and encourage them to fight. And when things got tense, then they used them as direct assistants. As such, when one side was defeated, women who had accompanied them would be captured as well as the men. In Islam, the ruling of free them or ransom them would apply to women captives as well. In the case of ransom, it was taken from one of her family members. If there were no one to claim them or exchange with or pay their ransom, or they had no one to take care of them, and this happened often, then Muslims would take them to their homes. Here, Quran encourages Muslim men who were single and could not afford to get married with free women to marry these captive women and start a family with them, and that Muslims had no right to have intimate relations with them outside marriage, as explicitly mentioned in chapter 4, where it says, "If any of you cannot afford to marry free believing women, they may marry believing maids from among those whom their right hands possess," means the owners. "And Allah has full knowledge about your fate. You are one from another. Marry them with the permission of their owners, and give them their dowers according to what is reasonable. They should be women in marriage and chaste, not taking lovers." Chapter 4, verse 25. Of course, in case these women ended up marrying no one, they would stay with their owners, their masters. However, Islam encourages Muslims to get them married, especially those who were captured in a war whose husbands were killed and their relatives did not care to come and ransom them. This way, they would be protected from vagrancy, distress, and possible prostitution. As the Quran says, وَأَنكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّالِحِينَ مِنْ عِبَادِكُمْ وَإِمَائِكُمْ إِنْ يَكُونُوا فُقَرَاءَ يُغْنِهِمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ وَاللَّهُ وَاسِعٌ عَلِيمٌ. Marry those among you who are single and the pious of your slave men or women. If they are in poverty, Allah will give them means out of His grace. He is bountiful and all-knowing. Chapter 24, verse 32. So the laws and rights regarding captives or slaves are not limited to what we mentioned here. They are fully explained in the books of fiqh and hadith. It is important to note that by slaves or captives, we're really talking about people who were part of enemy's camp, who participated in a war against Muslims. And in the process, they either killed Muslims or assisted in killing Muslims. Yet, Islam holds protection rules and rights for them after their capture and encourages Muslims to marry them or ransom them or set them free so they can integrate into the society and eventually slavery disappears. So let's make a conclusion here. In general terms, all Muslim scholars are in agreement that Islam allows taking captives only in conditional war. That means any group or nation who is not at war with Muslims and has a peace treaty with Muslims, implicit or explicit, they are protected from taking captives. This is based on the Quranic verse that says, فَإِنْ اعْتَزَلُوكُمْ فَلَمْ يُقَاتِلُوكُمْ وَأَلْقَوْا إِلَيْكُمُ السَّلَمَ فَمَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ عَلَيْهِمْ سَبِيلًا. Therefore, if they withdraw from you, but do not fight you, and instead send you guarantees of peace, then Allah has opened no way for you to war against them. Chapter 4, verse 90. The term فَمَا جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ عَلَيْهِمْ سَبِيلًا, Allah has opened no way for you against them, means you cannot engage in any activity against them, which includes taking captives. Quran further says, فَمَا اسْتَقَامُوا لَكُمْ فَاسْتَقِيمُوا لَهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْمُتَّقِينَ. As long as these stand true to you, stand true to them, for Allah does love the righteous. Chapter 9, verse 7. As long as they have not defaulted the peace treaty, they have not reneged their oath, you must stand true to it as well. And Allah loves the God conscious. Therefore, the captives are taken from the combatant unbelievers in a war, not the peaceful unbelievers, because there were two kinds. There were peaceful unbelievers, they just didn't accept Islam and they wanted to stay in their own faith, but they didn't fight Muslims. And then there were unbelievers who fought Muslims. About after taking captives as a result of war, Islam has rulings regarding their treatment which are chosen from many ways available, many available options. But Islam has chosen some and discarded others. Well, what are these options? Well, option one, Islam could have ordered them be killed after capture, like Crusades did, which was torture and execution from followers of so-called religion of peace. But Islam enjoined the opposite, to be kind to the captives, marry them, free them, and eventually integrate them into the society as equals. Just a side note here. According to Stephen Runciman, he has a book called A History of Crusades, Volume 1. He writes, quote, "After all the hardship and pain, when Crusades gained a big victory over Muslims, they lost all their senses and humanity and poured into streets and homes and slaughtered Muslim men, women, and children without any reservation. Next day, a group of soldiers entered the mosques where Muslims had taken refuge and slaughtered them all. The Jewish citizens, too, who had taken refuge in their synagogues, Crusades set their synagogues on fire, with them in it, because they had cooperated with Muslims. It is interesting that when Muslims recaptured Jerusalem, they treated the defeated Christians' army gracefully, so much so that Europeans were amazed." Unquote. So Stephen Runciman, in his book, in the volume 2, A History of Crusades, regarding Muslim men, writes, quote, the victors were honorable and compassionate. In exact location where 88 years ago, the Westerners had created a sea of blood, not one house was pillaged, and not a life was taken on the orders of Salahuddin. His soldiers took the control of the gates and streets and protected everyone from any harm, looting or pillage. Unquote. This from A History of Crusades, Volume 2. So, as we were talking, so option 1, Islam could have killed all the captives, but it did not. That's not the option Islam took. Option 2, Muslims could free the captives as soon as they were captured and return them to their camp. Obviously, this was not a viable option or in the interest of Muslims, because the enemy never guaranteed that they would not return these soldiers back to the battlefield. So there was no guarantee. You free them and they'll come back to fight you. It is interesting to know that, by the way, Montesquieu, the great French judge and political philosopher, in his book, The Spirit of Laws, writes, quote, "It is not prudent to free all captives at once according to some special law because it can have social and political implications. Freeing captives must be gradual, and the lawmakers must allow slaves to gain wages through work in order to save and eventually gain their freedom from their masters." Unquote. This is exactly the right-in or contract ruling by Islam, which was implemented many centuries before Montesquieu mentioned it in his book, among many other rulings that we mentioned earlier. Having said that, Prophet ﷺ, after the Battle of Hawazin, freed 6,000 captives, as he saw no harm in doing so. Therefore, Muslim leaders could do so if it was prudent. Through this, plus through all the other ways mentioned earlier, Islam paved the way to total abolishment of slavery in the later years. Option 3. Under circumstances that freeing captives was not advisable, Islam could have ordered Muslims to put them in labor camps, as we see some countries did before and still do today, even with citizens of their own country. However, instead, Islam chose to divide them divide the captives, and each Muslim took them to their homes as servants until they could gain their freedoms through the rulings that we mentioned earlier. And of course, in the meanwhile, treating them kindly and with compassion, which is far better than labor camps or prisons like Abu Ghraib. Labor camps increase hate and animosity, whereas taking them home allows them to live with Muslims, get closer to them and their culture, and eventually integrate into their society as free men and women. In summary, if we look at the standard in Islam regarding the treatment of captives and slaves, in all certainty we can find no other doctrine or school of thought or faith or written law that can come even close to doctrine of Islam regarding the treatment of the enemy captives in fairness, in compassion and leniency, if we were fair-minded. And of course, if we do not consider, for instance, the shameful actions of slave traders or lustful emirs or some Muslim leaders as Islamic teaching, where Prophet ﷺ has said about them, quote, worst people are those who sell human beings, unquote. During the time of Prophet ﷺ, there were so many evils in the social life of Arabia. The Prophet wanted to reform all those evils according to Islam, and the method he opted was not a revolutionary one. Rather, it was what we may call it evolutionary method. An evolutionary method is gradual. An example of this evolutionary method can be seen in the case of slavery. At that time, slavery was widespread everywhere in the world, including Arabia. It even enjoyed the status of highly established institution. But the Prophet avoided a path that would seek to abolish slavery right in the beginning stage of his movement for reform. Instead, he adopted a gradual process of trying to remove the evil by way of education, teaching, and explaining by peaceful methods. God revealed verses in the Quran that enjoined the Prophet to persuade people to be kind to their slaves. It all started there. These verses sought to change the very view of slaves in the eyes of slave owners. The Quran then referred to slaves not as slaves but as human beings, no different from their masters, equal to all other men and deserving of respect, dignity, and treatment, which is nothing but the right of all human beings. In those days, slaves were a common commodity traded in the marketplace. So, had slavery been immediately abolished, it was bound to create numerous problems and chaos. It would have been as if a war was being waged with such chaos as it would be the result of abolishing, for instance, the ownership of all homes at a time when everyone owned their own house, for example. So this was intertwined in their culture. So Islam launched a twofold movement. On one front, it continuously discouraged the taking of new slaves. On the other front, it also continuously ingrained into the mindset of society that freeing a slave was a noble act, an incomparable virtue, even to the extent that one was encouraged to purchase new slaves solely for the purpose of freeing them. So the Prophet and his companions began to purchase slaves from their masters and set them free. This example clearly illustrates the Islamic method for removing social evils. This was the very method that was adopted by the Prophet to remove all the other prevalent social evils. We just wish the Muslim leaders today would adopt the same method rather than forcing people to do certain things. Just like anything else that West accuses Islam for, slavery is another thing West alleges that Islam approved or legitimized. And it is hypocritical of the West, with such a dark history in slavery, to slander Islam for it. Through these two sessions, we presented the cases where, either through explicit verses of the Quran or prophetic narrations, or both, Islam discouraged slavery in general, and over a gradual course of ownership encouraged freeing slaves. Hence, over a period of time, abolished it altogether from the Muslim nation long before Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Thereby, case closed. Case closed. Muslims need to educate themselves and educate others by proudly making proclamation of their own, which is Islam abolished slavery through a brilliant strategy over 1400 years ago in such a way that no slave owner was displeased with its ruling, nor left Islam because of it. Society did not revolt, hence no civil wars because of it. We ask Allah to guide us and increase our knowledge about His deen so that we may invite and educate others regarding topics like this. We ask Allah to help all those in this world who are unjustly held in captivity, and those who are being exploited in work camps or factories by evil beings. For example, one being the Muslims in Uyghur, Xinjiang province in China. May Allah help them and ease their condition. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihat wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. والسلام على من اتبع الهدى.